Welcome and thank you to everyone for joining us. Today, we're going to discuss an up and coming topic in biosafety, and that is a trend that we see towards customizing biosafety cabinets to fit a specific application. The ability to get a tailor-made cabinet can create a lot of opportunities for your lab. It also prompts a lot of questions, or at least it should. When do you really need a custom biosafety cabinet? If you do, who designs it for you? How will you maintain it going forward? The answers to these questions come from looking at the project from multiple angles, including from a risk assessment perspective, an engineering perspective, and even a future maintenance perspective. So we've gathered a team of diverse experts here to help you do just that. Our first guest, Julianne Baron, is the president of Science and Safety Consulting, which offers biosafety consulting and writing services to organizations around the country. She's a registered biosafety professional with the American Biological Safety Association International, or ABSA. She also holds a Ph.D. in Infectious Diseases and Microbiology from the University of Pittsburgh, and finally completed a Postdoctoral Fellowship with the National Biosafety and Biocontainment Training Program, or NBBTP. Bill Peters is a president and CEO of Newer Incorporated, which manufactures biosafety cabinets. He has 35 years of experience engineering primary barriers and other engineering controls for life science research, pharmacy compounding, animal research, and other industries. He's a member of the NSF Committee for Biosafety Cabinetry, and he's contributed to articles for the Controlled Environment Testing Association, or CETA. Last but certainly not least, Jim Wagner is the president of Controlled Environment Consulting, and he comes to us with 40 years of experience working with cleanrooms and other engineering controls. He's a recognized authority in this field, and he is also a member of the NSF Joint Biosafety Cabinetry Committee. He also has contributed to articles for the Controlled Environment Testing Association, and he's known for delivering many webinars on topics such as cleanroom design, certification, and compliance. So starting out here, just to set a bit of a baseline, starting with you, Julianne, from a risk assessment perspective, when you're handling biological materials, what types of equipment are commonly used in what is just a standard, let's say 3, 4, or 6 foot class 2 biosafety cabinet?
Yeah, hi Seth. Thanks for having me. So often when we're working with biological materials in ways that can generate aerosols or splashes, such as pipetting or vortexing, those are often times when we would want to handle those in a biosafety cabinet or primary containment device. Oftentimes this is can be using equipment such as vortexes, small or micro centrifuges, blenders, sonicators, grinders, those sort of things often fit really well in a biosafety cabinet. But when we're thinking about that, we're not only thinking about the physical fit, we're also thinking about the process and the workflow and whether you can do all of the required tasks inside of the biosafety cabinet while that piece of equipment is in there with your work as well.
So then kind of pivoting to kind of main topic today, then what about larger pieces of equipment? Let's say automation equipment that processes biological materials. How would the lab determine that those larger pieces of equipment also need to be placed in a biosafety cabinet?
Yeah, so it's again, like you said, toward that risk assessment. So we're thinking about pieces of equipment and materials that are going to be handling biological agents or biological materials, and that could generate an aerosol or a splash and potentially be hazardous to individuals. But a standard biosafety cabinet may not be big enough to fit them and their required airflow. So these are things such as cell sorters or flow cytometers, bioreactors, bioprinters, and automated liquid handling devices. These are pieces of equipment that can be rather large and require a lot of extra space that might not fit in a traditional biosafety cabinet. But if the risk assessment determines that they really need to be contained, then we need to look at something bigger, like a custom biosafety cabinet, in order to handle those pieces of equipment safely.
Okay. So if that point comes that from a risk assessment standpoint, we determine that we need an enclosure, opening up to the other people we also have here, Jim and Bill as well. So who should the lab involve when that point comes? They determine they need a custom BSc. Who should they involve, and at what point should they involve other people such as certifiers, engineers, et cetera?
So from my perspective in the field, ultimately the certifier is going to come in and certify that space. But before the certifier ever gets there, there has to be an engineering department that is designing the exhaust system if the unit's going to be vented to the outside. If it is going to be vented to the outside, obviously it's going to affect the HVAC back into that. So all manners of maintenance staff and whoever is going to be controlling the airflow. The certifier, when they come in, they're going to have to do site installation assessment tests, which include setting up the alarms and any interlocks that have to be in there. So they're going to need the ability to control that airflow during the certification process, as well as setting it up for future operation.
Yes. This is Bill here. From what Jim had said, the facilities departments really need to be involved right up front, not only from the standpoint of what Jim talked about on the airflow and connection, but also from the mechanical side and also from the physical side of moving the equipment into the facility and how you're going to get it in. Does it have to be disassembled and reassembled, or can we get it in a one-piece configuration for what we're trying to accomplish?
Yeah, and I'll add too. So often, in addition to facilities and engineering, having conversations with the company that is ultimately going to manufacture the biosafety cabinet, as well as the company that is manufacturing or providing the piece of equipment that you need to fit in the cabinet, as well as your safety group and anyone else who maybe has a similar process and has already kind of gone through these questions with the manufacturer and with the BSc manufacturer. All of these people are really critical to make sure that what you're getting and what you're paying for are going to be useful, and they're going to control the risks with the work that you're performing.
So when you're working with that manufacturer, let's say you're going to approach a manufacturer and say, I need this oversized biosafety cabinet, let's say, as we talked about, you have to plan ahead to fit inside your lab. To even get that design right, when the lab discovers it's going to need a customized cabinet, what type of information should it provide then to that manufacturer who is presumably going to provide this customized design for them?
Yeah, so I'll say as much information as possible is really the best. So I think, beyond just the dimensions and the weight of the actual piece of equipment, you really need to think about if you need a space inside containment that is next to the device to do any kind of prep work or processing before your samples go into the equipment. It's easy enough to have that within the same biosafety cabinet. And but you need to make sure that the airflow is going to be appropriate. So you need to think about that in advance. Again, the weight, so the base of the biosafety cabinet work surface might need to be reinforced depending upon how heavy the equipment is. Oftentimes, these devices have a really big power draw, and plugging them into the biosafety cabinet can impact the energy that's available for the biosafety cabinet to power itself, in addition to the device that is inside. And we also want to think about things such as vibration sensitivities. So if you have a really sensitive piece of equipment that is sensitive to vibrations, that base may need to be more reinforced so that there aren't any issues when that piece of equipment is functional. And then also heating and cooling. If the process generates a lot of heat, and Bill can talk to this, there can be coils put in to kind of cool the system down or warm it up if it needs to be. And then thinking about service requirements as far as, how do you access the device? Does it need to come in or out of the biosafety cabinet once it's been installed, or is it going to permanently be in there? But I think those are some of the initial things. And I'll turn it to Bill and Jim for some more thoughts on that.
Yeah, I would say the biggest thing is to understand, other than the physical limitations of what you just discussed, Understanding the process is probably one of the most important things the manufacturer can do. So we understand how the user will interface, what service needs to be provided on the machine itself, whether the machine typically has some type of output on it, whether it's a pipette tip that needs to be exchanged or put into a garbage, and does that need to be under containment or not? You really need to understand how the interface and how we're going to do it. And then we can look at all the physical limitations. A lot of the machines today do move in small increments to thousandths of an inch. So we have to make sure that the work surface and the machine itself is very solidly built to make sure we can have repeatability when you're dealing with the precise and precision that needs to be done on these machines today. And then lastly, you need to bring it back up, and that kind of goes into Jim's category of looking at how are we going to maintain and service this product over the years. What access do they need, and what repeatable processes do they need to make sure containment is going to be maintained through the years?
I think, Bill, I'd like to add on to that. When we talk about biological safety cabinets, we typically think of containment. Oftentimes, these are going to be used in a manufacturing setting. If it's a sterile manufacturing, if it's FDA regulated, we have to think about the verification that would be required, particle count testing. Often, they're going to want to have permanent probes installed inside for particle counting, and certainly that needs to be given to you, Bill, at the beginning when you're designing these, and make sure that we get that probe in a manner that isn't going to interfere with their work, interfere with first air, but yet give them the good sampling that they need.
Yep, absolutely. They have to consider whatever the space is, whether it's the primary device itself or the secondary system. Is it going into a GMP type laboratory where we have to maintain an air quality level through that process also? So we have to have all those into considerations of what we're going to do upon the design of the product.
I think to both of your points, talking about workflow and thinking about the process, there's also often sometimes with these pieces of equipment, additional devices that need to be connected, but outside of containment. So if they're run through some kind of computer system, or there's a waste collection stream that comes out of the equipment that doesn't need to be contained, these devices can have ports or other pieces of connection to the outside for equipment that doesn't need to go inside the containment device, but that needs to be planned in advance and could be built into the cabinet if there's not an existing benchtop that's nearby to put that type of equipment on.
Yeah, absolutely. Ports can be put in, whether you're talking for electrical, mechanical aspects of it, but even physical aspects of it. If you have a kind of an auto cell culture incubator that might need to be associated with this process, that might contain well plates, we can build negative pressure ports that can be accessed through the side of the cabinet. That allows for product to be moved in and out of the product. And if needed be, if it is a contained process, we can get into sealed pass-throughs also that go into associated pieces of equipment. Could be another BSC that's right next to this BSC that houses a liquid handler, where essentially you can contain the entire process from start to finish. So that's why I'm saying you really need to understand this process of how we're going to work with it, how the users are going to work and through the entire area in order to make sure the system is functional from a process standpoint.
Perfect. And we've kind of segued into this a little bit already. The next question I was going to ask too was about that we define the process, because that's the starting point, like you said, is one of the important starting points. And you've already touched on a little bit. What kinds of customizations then do we have to make to accommodate that specific process? As you already touched on some of them, besides the ones already mentioned, what customizations do you typically see, especially from your perspective, Bill, often customers require you to put in their cabinet?
Sky is the limit here, very honestly. We have done some very different customizations for different things. The most common customization is just larger whether it's a deeper, wider, higher work zone area to accommodate towers of liquid handlers and cell sorters or things like that. Some of the other aspects is as we talked about waste streams, where we've done some ports that go through the bottom of the cabinets to discard items as they're being work process flow. And then it's a matter of what inputs and outputs you need for the particular process that you're doing. These can come through the side or the rear of the cabinet. Obviously, the top of the cabinet with the HEPA filtration that's going vertically from top to bottom, that can't be really altered at all. But we can alter a lot of the interior spaces that can accommodate different aspects of the machines. And then the other thing we have to also be kind of just aware of is a lot of these machines, that if they do produce heat, they have fans that are inside of them. We have to make sure when we're looking at that device itself is not going to impact the containment performance or the sterility if you're trying to maintain sterility of the product as it's processing through. So we have to make sure that that's also working through its process of how we do that. So I'm not going to say we're not going to say no to any customization, but we do a very wide variety of customizations, and we really just need to understand the process and see what attributes we need to do in order to maintain containment and work best for the processes that we can offer the customer.
Bill, it's often obvious to me in the certification process when one of these customized safety cabinets has been modified for a particular piece of equipment, that in the manufacturing process, they obviously spent a lot of time making sure it's configured in. We, as certifiers, will end up doing a dynamic airflow smoke pattern test out in the field. How much of that do you guys do at the factory, making sure heat sources are by returns and making sure large flat objects aren't pushing air where they don't want it to be? How much do you get involved in that, Bill, in your manufacturing process?
Great question, Jim. We absolutely right up front. That's part of the configuration of whatever the product we're putting into, is to evaluate how the airflow of the device is going to impact the airflow of the cabinet. So as you know, when we do different customizations to different products, we use the basically the NSF process, NSF 49 process, to establish performance of the cabinet. So all of the different configurations we do at some point in time have had traces to biological tolerance testing that we do on the equipment to make sure we can pass containment. And then we also build mock-ups of the devices. And in some cases, people send the devices directly to us, where we can install them and actually perform this testing on the product itself. And then more, which would go in towards what you're concerned about, is then we do smoke testing and make sure that we pass biological testing, and then we repeat that just with smoke testing, so we can see what the expectation of what you, the certifier, will see in the field. And if we need to, we can relay that information to you directly. And not only from an airflow smoke perspective, but also from velocities. So we will take a velocity profile without the equipment inside and with the equipment inside to look at the influences and be able to provide that information to you, the certifier, when you do the installation, and try to do that repeat testing to assure that what we do here and what with the testing we do from a containment point follows through in the field to you, the certifier.
So the interesting point there, Bill, is that there's no magic number what velocities I set that cabinet to. I must set it to numbers you tell me.
Yeah.
And I think you've alluded to a couple different ways you do it. Some of it is with microbiological testing. You verify where your nominal set points would be, I guess. And then the other one would be smoke pattern testing. What differentiates when you set it up to the microbiological testing versus the smoke pattern?
We always have to make sure that at one point in time that we have a microbiological test to lean back on with the tests. Like I said, we follow the NSF 49 process. It's not like when we're building a standard cabinet, we microbiological test every single one we manufacture. We don't do that. We manufacture and look at a type test to make sure we do it. Then we send the product to NSF as a third party. They actually do the testing too to validate what we do. And then we look at airflow patterns and airflow velocities after that point on every single product we manufacture. So we follow that same process here. We don't have the third-party validation through NSF for these custom products. We do the validation in ourselves in our own microbiological laboratory that we do on initial testing of the product. So every different configuration of large configuration of product that we manufacture, at one point in time, we have microbiological tested that to make sure. And we look at those influences. And then we look at smoke patterns after that and make sure we can continue that for the different products that we manufacture from that point on with smoke testing. The only variable, like I said, may come in is looking at product configuration. If we see that some product that they're going to put inside of the cabinet varies too much from where we would originally have tested, we will then actually mock up and retest to make sure that we're going to hold containment through the process. And then also look at velocities and look at airflow smoke patterns so we can relay it back to you, the certifier.
That gives me a lot of confidence in when I set it up, that I know I'm setting it up to the right spot. I think the important piece here for the owners of this equipment will be making sure your certifier is in communication with the manufacturer so that they are setting it up to the right numbers. Because I would assume as you're modifying an existing cabinet to configure properly for what they're putting in there, you're changing these set points. So I need to know that. And are you communicating that on a data plate, or are you communicating that through owner's manuals, or the best way to communicate that to the certifier?
We would absolutely provide an owner manual with each product that we modify to state the new airflows. We also provide a inspection sheet that we actually use internally here with our testing as the process goes through the manufacturing process. All of that information is provided to the certifier also. So they have both pieces of item. If the data plate changes, it would change. So if it's a standard larger product and we needed to alter the airflow, the data plate would also indicate that alteration too. So we have continuity between the product, the manual, and the inspection test report that we provide with the equipment.
And Bill, maybe just for people who wouldn't be familiar, what does that biological testing include, and how sort of basically is that performed?
The microbiological testing that we perform, and we're looking at personnel protection, we're looking at product protection, and we're looking at environmental protection. And these are the standard 3 tests that NSF runs, NSF International runs, and then we repeat that with the standard protocol that they provide. And we're basically using a bacillus as our tracer material that we nebulize and aerosolize. So if we're looking at personnel protection, we will aerosolize that from the inside of the cabinet. And then we have collection points through slit samplers and impingers on the exterior of the cabinet that's sampling the air barrier to make sure that the bacillus does not escape the cabinet. And just from a reference point of view, we're providing 10 to the 8th of a challenge on the bacillus concentration, and we're basically saying you cannot have more than 10 colony forming units in the impingers and 5 colony forming units on the slit samplers. When you get into the product protection, we're doing the same thing, but we're moving the nebulizer to the exterior of the cabinet, and we're sampling basically just through auger dishes that are set on the work tray of the cabinet. And we're only allowed 2 colony forming units on the interior of the cabinet for this challenge. And then from an environmental protection or let's say a process protection, we also do side challenges where we nebulize from the center of the cabinet and look from side to side how much the bacteria flows, and at that point, it cannot flow more than 14 inches from center point, either direction, to make sure that we can maintain the typical work relationship of a clean and dirty work that is stated in the NIH BMBL that says 12 inches be separation between your clean and dirty parts. So we do that regularly on standard products and for custom products as needed to test and validate the custom designs.
Yeah, it sounds like a really rigorous process just to make sure that, you're getting those 3 levels of protection that you're expecting from a class 2, even if it's not a standard BSc and it's one of these custom cabinets.
Yeah, it is a very rigorous program, and it definitely challenges us as a manufacturer. Some of the products we make are very large in scale, where we normally do this testing within a clean room. We actually had to move the testing into our production floor in order to accommodate some of the larger products we do. But we absolutely have to make sure we validate at least one design style of the product to make sure it's going to hold containment the way it needs to be.
So with building, such a large unit, we touched on some of this earlier, especially with oversized units. Julianne and Jim, I think you especially talked about that can impact the laboratory's planning for that installation. Circling back to that for just a moment, besides some of the things you mentioned before, you're getting the unit into the facility, what other things are going to be impacted by having a different unit being installed in your facility? How does that affect your install plan?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is obviously the larger these cabinets get, the more difficult it is to physically maneuver them, and the more difficult it would be to fit them through a standard size door or even a door with a adjustable pocket to allow it to be a bigger opening at some instances. Thinking about trying to get them through laboratory spaces. So often biological safety cabinets are located farthest away from the door or deeper into a facility, especially if we're talking about a containment laboratory, because that's where the more hazardous work is being performed. So thinking about getting those physical devices deep into a laboratory and far in, you really need to think about how physically can it fit. And then also thinking about things like, the clearances like Bill had mentioned, where if you need service ports or the equipment needs to come out on a regular basis, you need to have a lot of clearance in front of the cabinet, probably potentially more so than you would need for a standard biosafety cabinet, because, you could have large double doors that open and a big a work surface that can roll out, and you need a lot of clearance. And also, as Jim mentioned, if it needs to be connected to the building exhaust system, it needs to be placed or constructed somewhere near an exhaust port or an exhaust ductwork that can be adjusted to attach to the device. So there's a lot of considerations for moving, and there are definitely ways to account for these, such as, having a modular unit. It doesn't all come completely built, and it's more built in place. But as you're thinking about changing your laboratory processes or designing and building a new lab space, if you need one of these larger cabinets, you should really be thinking about that from the beginning, so you can think about where to place casework, where to place ductwork. The electrical draw of the cabinet as well is important, and where you could plug it in physically. So there are a lot of points to that, and I'll let Jim, touch on some more of them.
So every cabinet is going to have to be certified, not only at installation, but then typically annually thereafter. In some cases, even more frequent than that, semi-annual in typically FDA-regulated facilities. The considerations that have to be normally thought about, you just take for granted. You go into a normal biological safety cabinet, you remove diffuser screens to leak test HEPA filters. often in these bigger configurations, the equipment that's placed in there makes it challenging to do some of the normal testing. So if you have to remove a diffuser screen, are you going to have the ability to do that? And if you can't remove the diffuser screen, you might have to do some special validations in terms of what impact does that diffuser screen have on any leak and your ability to find a leak. We have validated that in some cases the certain diffuser screen that's used, depending on percent open of that screen, we might have to reduce our acceptance criteria by 50% or so, and then we can leak test through that screen. But especially if it's in a GMP facility, you're going to have that validation data, and that just there's no general validation you can do. You're going to have to do it for each cabinet based on the airflow, based on the percent open of that screen. So making sure that you can do the normal testing that's required, probably the biggest thing will be with respect to the filter leak testing, but also airflow testing. How are we going to test the alarms? How are we going to test the interlocks? I don't know that that's a lot different than any other biosafety cabinet, but if there's special configurations they needed to make in the manufacturing process, we might have to do some unique things for that.
Yeah, just to add in that your initial question there, part of understanding the process and then looking at the facility and how we're going to work with that, how we design the equipment, whether it's one piece configuration or a multi-piece configuration, which is actually disassembled and assembled in the space that it is, we would absolutely do that and can have the capability of doing that. And that's part of the most important part of the upfront discussion is when you're doing this, we create a specification for the actual device itself, point out the highlights, but probably the most important thing is give a detailed drawing with dimensions. And if it's a broken down device, we actually break down each individual piece with dimensions so you can see exactly what size everything is, that we can walk it through the facility and get it where it needs to be. And then just to respond to Jim, yes, we are also considering how we are going to certify that with the piece of equipment in. If we need to, we can split diffusers so they can be taken down in multi-pieces so they can have access to that from that process. So all of that is part of the consideration of when you're designing the piece of equipment for that, whether it's just minor modifications or a large modifications for a specific process that the customer is going to be doing.
How big do these cabinets get? Are there ever any considerations that, geez, I'd like to put it in this room, but I can't because it's I don't have the weight capacity of the floor? Are they ever get that big?
I haven't seen from a floor capacity. That would be pretty big, but the largest, what we consider the largest large door, which is the kind of the open door style products that we manufacture. We've made one 14 feet long and 4 feet deep that housed a complete automation system within the product itself. Okay. And as far as like a disassembled product, I saw one last year that actually was 8 feet deep and 8 feet wide. It was very, very large. It had been an interesting certification aspect to get into something like that, to accommodate that. You physically would have had to get into the device itself. Which then they would absolutely need to be in contact with the certifier to say, hey, in order to certify this, what are you working with? What level of material are you working with? And do we actually have to mitigate that before you do a certification? Do you have to do a decon on that product before you certify it? So those, again, it's part of that process, and it's part of making sure you talk to the manufacturer, talking to the certifier, and really understanding the total scope of working with these devices when they get very, very customized. Yeah.
So Bill, when you have one that's modular, needs to be disassembled, who typically goes in and does that reassembly? And then is there any kind of testing you do after it's reassembled, beyond maybe certification, just to make sure that it's functioning still once you put it all back together?
Typically, I'm not going to say typically because it handles every which way, but there are certification companies like Jim's that actually can do reinstallation of products, and there's a few out there. There are usually other third-party installers of equipment that would be coming in that actually would be the movers that actually move the pieces in, and sometimes they can offer assembly. We would work from our factory, along with our sales representative, would work to make sure that process is done from start to finish from a smooth perspective to assure that the product gets up and functioning properly. And then as far as that person could even be a factory person that comes from our factory that goes out and does the installation. I've personally installed some of these large equipment pieces myself. And then as you're trying to put it back together, obviously everything is labeled. Electrical connections need to be made, and we provide schematics for that. They do need to be exercised, let's say, to make sure that all is functioning first. And then the certifier can come in and do his job with a functioning unit to do the testing he needs to do to assure product compliance.
Okay, perfect. No, this is really important to really lay out to the customer. A lot of due diligence, it sounds like, in a reality, seems to be one of the main takeaways is think ahead to what you're going to have to do after you purchase the unit to maintain it. Well, install it, first of all, then maintain it thereafter. From the different perspectives that you guys have from a safety aspect, engineering aspect, of course, future certification aspect, what do you find are perhaps some of the main, let me put it this way, what would you like to be a main takeaway for viewers from this discussion here today? Maybe common things that are overlooked or misunderstood about getting a custom unit. What would you say would be some of the main pieces of advice you would give to a lab looking at having something bespoke made?
From a certification perspective, really what are you certifying? You're going to be certifying airflow. So we need to make sure that everybody involved in it knows what the proper components of this are. So exhaust volumes, often when we test exhaust volume, we place a capture hood on the front of the cabinet and we measure intake volume that way. We measure exhaust volume by doing a duct traverse. So there's different people going to be involved in the process. The air balancer is going to measure airflow differently than the certifier will. Typically, those numbers that he's going to be setting it to are different. So we need to make sure each trade gets the right information. Air balancer is usually going to use, with some biosafety cabinets, we refer to it as a concurrent balance value. Certifiers will have certifier values, but don't give the air balancer the certifier values. Make sure you get the right trade, the right information. The next thing is leak testing filters. When we go to leak test filters, we've already talked about the diffuser screens, but we have to have the ability to get in there and create an aerosol, which is going to bring contamination into the room. So if this is put in a clean room space, realize there's going to be some disruption to that process. The rest of the testing really won't be too disruptive, except for dynamic tests. We do dynamic smoke pattern tests to make sure that they're using first air properly. We will need the actual people that are working in the hood to do it dynamic. Now, this is something in a GMP environment they're used to. We go into a GMP environment, no problem with that. Yep, we're ready for you. We're going to do it. You're going to generate your smoke. You're going to run your particle counters, do all these different things. It's unusual to see people do that in a laboratory environment. But if it's a custom cabinet, it's just as important as it would be if this was in a pharmaceutical environment. So having the people who are going to actually work in the unit be a part of the end of that certification process, the dynamic smoke pattern test, so they understand airflows in the cabinet, they understand how they can load the cabinet and not load it, I think would be very beneficial, is having them a part of dynamic testing.
From my perspective, takeaways would be to ask questions. Be thoroughly informed, even if you may not know the questions to ask. Keep asking questions to make sure that you fully understand the process of what we're trying to do, because we're trying to extract as much information as we can to provide the products, a good product, functioning product. We'll be asking a lot of questions of the person purchasing the product, and then making sure we have all the documentation set properly, so the customer's fully understanding exactly how this is going to go from start to finish, to make sure that they're fully satisfied, and then the follow-up with what Jim just mentioned, as far as making sure that once it is installed, that it's going to be used properly and understood properly and be able to continue service.
Yeah, and I think from my perspective, for a laboratory user, so these are going to be, they're custom, they're going to be expensive devices. You really need to put a lot of thought into how are you going to use it? What processes from a safety perspective need to happen within the cabinet? I mean, as Bill said, these things can get very large, and they can really be built kind of to any size and shape specifications. So if you need space next to your liquid handler to do some additional work in the biosafety cabinet, mock up the size on a benchtop, what you need, how you're going to physically move samples in and out of that equipment, and have a good sense of the size, the adjacencies, the connection to other equipment, both inside and outside of the cabinet. Think about, as Bill was talking about earlier, where is your waste being generated? Does the waste need to be within the containment device once it's gone through the machine? All of these are things that can definitely be built in. But if you don't have these conversations about, the safety of the material that you're handling, what needs to be in and what needs to not be in containment, you can't really think about the device and also the biosafety cabinet in an effective way if you don't understand the whole process of exactly what you're using and how you want to use it. Because the goal of making one of these cabinets is that it's functional, it's usable, it's contained, and that it can be certified. So really involving everyone that might have a perspective on how to help and how to do the process is going to really be the best takeaway. Is ask questions, do mock-ups, have demonstrations, and just see what best meets your needs.
Like, all in all, this is a very, I think maybe the right word is almost multidisciplinary effort in a lot of ways to make a project like this, a success. And so we certainly thank you, all of you that are here, Julianne, Jim, Bill, for contributing your perspective. We know that looking at a project like this means taking the holistic view. We hope that for all of the viewers that you've benefited from this, and probably even maybe had your appetite whet to ask even more questions. Thanks so much for joining us, and we'll hope to have you join us again on the future content production.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.